it's my great pleasure to welcome Mick Keogh. Mick is head of the Australian Farm Institute, which I think is the premier think tank in rural Australia and agriculture. There's innumerable papers written every year and a conference run, and it's a really useful place to think about agriculture. And if you want to research what the thinking is around the world and what it's thinking here locally, look up the AFI. Mick's also been appointed, he's riding two horses at the moment, where he said he's been dragged around by two horses. He's also the Agriculture Commissioner for the ACCC. So he's right at the pointy end of a lot of sort of disputes and things that are happening in agriculture, but typically Mick, he will handle it with some confidence and aplomb. So please welcome Mick Keogh.
Thanks very much, Mike. I didn't realise until fairly late in the day that I was the last speaker on a 3-day marathon for you guys, and I was trying to think of a comparison, and I guess the best I could come up with is the 15th contestant on The Bachelorette. I know my looks aren't going to cut it, and I know most of what I'm going to say has already been said by everyone else, so how to attract the interest is going to be quite difficult. But so what I might do is skip through some of the early stuff, because I think you have been through a fair bit of that, and I do really want to focus on this issue of leadership and how the agriculture sector in Australia might better position itself in a whole range of fora through an improved leadership structure, I guess, through the industry. So, you know, if we start, what I wanted to do is look at about 5 or 6 things that I think are certainly going to be very significant in terms of what the future of agriculture looks like in Australia. I think the first thing, and I'm sure it's been certainly underlined in the discussion here today, is that we've moved from, and we is a terrible word, it's a collective noun that allocates no responsibility and makes it very uncertain who you're talking about, but the agriculture sector in Australia has moved from predominantly being a supplier of bulk commodities, if you think of the post-war years through to probably the late 80s, to one where the consumer is increasingly important. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he proposed this in 46, he got it right, and it hasn't changed. So as people get richer, they get fussier, we know that. So the advantage we get out of that is, for example, consumers prepared to pay $10 a kilo more for Heart Smart lamb cutlets. Okay, but on the other hand, they are also fussier. So we know that the premium markets are available, but the standards and the processes that might have been suitable for those consumers in a time when bulk commodities were the key requirement, and it was basically about feeding people, have certainly moved on when it comes to dealing with consumer markets at a more premium level. So we can't get away from that. I think the other thing that we also tend to forget is that moving into premium markets does move us into niche and smaller markets. And you know, the classic example is the trend in terms of meat consumption in Australia. We've gone from beef eaters to a situation where chicken has now overtaken beef, and in fact chicken consumption per capita is almost 4 times lamb consumption. So you know, the 2 red meats are obviously the premium meats. They are profitable and all that sort of stuff, but the reality is the markets available to them are much more specialised and much smaller, and that means a much more focused production system is required. That leads us to the issue of productivity. We certainly were the premium sector of the economy for productivity right through to about 97, 98. Since that time, depending on how you measure it, it's certainly been flat or declining in terms of productivity. Most of the productivity gains have been achieved over the last 2 or 3 decades by us getting very mean on inputs. So farm operators getting much more efficient with the use of inputs, while still able to slightly increase output. So I think, the critical question is how much further can that extend? How much leaner can people get or more precise can people get in the use of inputs, and in fact, does the productivity gain that will come in the future have to come from, you know, increased yields, better performance of products and livestock? You know, sectors like the cotton industry have been very successful at shifting that horizon. The broadacre industry is less so because of the less intensive production system. So that productivity challenge is there, irrespective of the fact that we're in more premium markets. And certainly when you compare us internationally, that's our productivity number there going out to 2010. And here are all the other countries that we compete against, and they've had that quite spectacular increase. There's been mention of New Zealand. I always like sticking it into the New Zealanders. They claim this wonderful lift in productivity as a result of them being smarter and doing things better. What it is actually they knocked down a lot of their forestry and converted that to dairy. So don't necessarily believe all that you hear from across the ditch, but still the message is there that there's a real productivity challenge in our ag sector here, and we are slipping behind other nations. Digital disruption, I know you've heard a lot about that. The move to increasingly convert to digital information, all the various aspects of production systems, and then try and use that in smart systems. That's certainly a change that's coming. I think we're probably going to see supply chain changes more quickly adopt and get an advantage out of this sort of stuff than we're necessarily going to see immediately on the farm, although it is starting to emerge. I think the area, and these are the sort of reasons I say that. If you look at the JBS lamb processing operation down at Bordertown in South Australia, from the minute that lamb carcass comes out of the chiller, not a single person touches it. Not a single person touches it. It goes right through the whole process and ends up in retail packs without a single person touching it. It's worth having a look at if you get a chance, or if you go onto YouTube and just look up Scott Automated Meat Processing, I think it is, it'll come up. You look at that and you think that's whiz-bang technology, isn't that fantastic? What I don't think we've come to grips with yet is the fact that that creates a completely objective assessment of the quality of that carcass. And that means that processor suddenly goes from a situation where they try and guess the carcass yield based on live weight to one where they'll have incredible amounts of data which will highlight exactly which bloodlines, which producer is producing the higher meat yielding carcasses and who isn't. So it's very much moving towards what you would call value-based marketing, where you could even see a situation where the price realised will based on the yield of cuts that you get out of that carcass rather than just a per head basis. We're also likely to be about 12 to 18 months away from the introduction of objective carcass grading in the beef industry. So one of the major players is currently negotiating contracts for that technology. So rather than a grader talking about butt shape and fat colour, it'll all be digital. And I think again that heralds the introduction of value-based marketing in, for example, the beef industry, which again will reward those who can be much more precise and deliver exactly what's required, but will disadvantage those who aren't up to the scratch. So I think that digital transformation, as I said, it's the supply chain impacts I think that we're going to see first, rather than the necessary application on the farm. Global markets, we've certainly heard that, you know, the 70% figure gets repeated ad nauseum. You know, the world's got to produce 70% more food between now and 2050. I keep reminding people that if they do their math, that works out at 1.7% compound growth a year. Okay? Now, I'm interested in anyone having a guess over the last 30 years, what's the average increase in agricultural output globally? Between 2.5 and just under 3. So here we are saying this is a fantastic opportunity. The world will be starving and farmers will be rich. But in fact, the numbers suggest that at a very aggregate level, the productivity requirement isn't that fantastic. It's not that dissimilar to what's been achieved over the last 30 years. So I think we just need to be careful about that, and we are very dependent on the global economy. It looks a bit dodgy at the moment, and what this figure shows you is the various forecasts that have been made at different times of what the actual global economic growth rates will be like. So that was the June 2014 forecast, that we were going to be back around 3.5% per annum by now. Then the January 15 forecast was lower than that. Then the June 15 forecast was lower than that again. Then the January 16, and then the June 16 coming out of the IMF. So, I think we need to be cognisant of the fact that global economic growth is still quite stagnant and certainly not matching what it used to. And that's probably interesting from the perspective that there's the graph of the value of global agricultural growth in trade in agricultural products since going back to 1961. And the critical point here is that inflection point occurred when China entered the WTO, dropped all its tariffs on agricultural imports because the trade-off China got was access to rich markets for its manufactured. So China basically made the decision, we're going to get rich from manufacturers, and the penalty we're going to pay is that we're going to have to allow food imports. So that's the sort of impact China had on global food markets, and of course at the same time the US and the EU adopted fairly strict biofuel mandates that now mean that 40% of US corn goes to biofuel. So there's certainly been a dramatic change in global trade. A lot of the free trade agreements reinforce that. Interestingly enough, the biggest growth has actually been fruit and vegetables, although meat and cereals have certainly grown a fair bit. That's probably created a change, and we're probably living through it, which this generation is different to previous generations. So if you look at the graph of global food prices between about 1970 and 2000, it was inexorably down at the aggregate level. Since that time, it's probably now at a point where, even with the big inflection around 2007 and 2008, when there was a big soft commodity spike, and then the GFC hit, and then there's been some recovery through 2010, and then more recently a downturn in commodity prices. But of those three classes of commodities, so oil, food and metals, food is certainly the one that seems to be recovering best and has been more sustainably higher over that period, and in fact you would say almost trending upwards. So certainly that emergence of China as a major market, that increased demand that generated in terms of the global food system, coupled with the free trade agreements, which meant you could actually trade food, has certainly changed the environment we're in, and we're certainly seeing that reflected in some of the commodity prices at the moment. And I always put this up just to remind anyone who says, oh, free trade agreements don't matter, blah, 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 blah. When you look at the value of farm production in Australia, a bit over 50 billion, the value of agricultural or food exports, about 45 billion. And the critics will say, yeah, but that's got the transport and the processing costs built into it. But, it's just a reminder, we depend on exports, so we should never forget that fact, and that's where the focus has got to be. 40% of our exports go to North Asia, so China, Korea and Japan. So that's clearly the focus. I mean, the interesting thing is, when we look at the next graph, here's one of the issues that we have to think about. North Asia, in terms of the rate, so this graph shows you the annualised rate of growth in agricultural import values by those regions, and the annualised rate of growth of Australian exports to those regions. And what it highlights is that we've held our own in North Asia, so those three markets, China, Japan, Korea, but in virtually every other market, the rate of growth of imports by that region has substantially overshadowed the rate of growth of our exports to those regions. So I guess it highlights two things. One is the point about the fact that we won't be the food bowl, but it also highlights that we're actually losing market share in all the other regions of the world except North Asia. So any sort of sense of complacency that trajectory of prices and the boom in demand for food is going to deliver us on a plate instant wealth, I think we need to just park that somewhere right in the background and not bring it into consideration. Those sort of changes are leading to changes in industry structures. I guess you're all familiar with this. The trajectory in terms of number of farm businesses is about 1.5% reduction each year, and that certainly hasn't changed over 30 to 40 years. The reason the numbers get a bit confusing is the ABS discovered an extra 50,000 farmers in 2005. They changed the category, and so that blue line represents ABS's estimate of the number of farmers. But yes, but you know that's the trajectory that is the reality of the consolidation and the specialisation that's occurring within the agriculture sector. I think this is the more interesting graph. So we're seeing that reduction in the number of farms, and everyone says, "Oh, that's terrible, isn't it? It makes it harder for young people to get in and all that sort of stuff." But in fact, the agriculture sector has gone from a sector of, so the blue line is the employers or owner-operators in the agriculture sector, and the red line is the employment, the employees in the agriculture sector. So we've gone from a sector that was owner-operators to one where increasingly the owner is the employer of workers, and that includes specialists, in other words, technical advisors, agronomists, preg testing scanners, AI specialists, all that sort of. So we're moving to a situation where a lot of the employment in agriculture is actually being generated in services to agriculture, in specialist advisory service and those sort of things. So I think that's quite an important change that we need to keep in mind, particularly when we talk about careers in agriculture and what they might look like in the future. The growth in the careers is in services to agriculture rather than agriculture itself. And we're certainly moving to that situation. The blue line there represents the proportion of farms. Across the bottom, it's the size of the turnover of those farms, so less than 100,000, 100 to 200, 200 to 400,000, and more than 400,000. And you know, the Pareto rule exists where that 25% of farm businesses in above 400,000 turnover are producing, getting towards 75% of the total output. So increasingly we're seeing that concentration of production in less and less farms. And again, people say, "Oh, isn't that terrible?" And you say, no, it's not. This number of farms down this end is in fact quite stable, most of them supported by off-farm income, and most of them the most drought-resistant, resilient, persistent farm operations that you'll ever see, because they don't rely completely on the farm. So, and they contribute greatly to rural communities and all that sort of stuff. So I don't see this as a tragedy. I think it's probably not a bad development. And as the discussion has said, that means, you know, the asset value associated with a farm on an average broadacre farm now is getting very close to $5 million. So that gives us a bit of a reality check when we say, why can't young people get into farmers? Well, my kids live in the city and I can't fund them $5 million to get into a business. So I think we just need to keep all that in mind when we talk about the models that might persist into the future. I guess the other thing that's happening is the development of these dedicated supply chains. So we're going from the open cry auction system, which particularly in the broadacre industries was and the livestock industries were predominant, to situations where there's much more contracted supply chains built around brands and all those sorts of things. Some would say it's been a long time coming, but it's certainly an interesting development that changes the way farm businesses operate. So what do we know about the future? What will it look like? We'll have about 25,000 farms producing about 50 billion plus in annual output. That's where we are at the moment. Farm owners increasingly working on, not in the businesses. So my father started off as a shearer and physically did most of the work on the farm through most of his life. My brothers, who now run that farm, are basically organisers. They've got a team of people that work there, and it's their job to organise them. So they spend much more time working on the business than in the business. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. More intense systems and more precise management. So you've been talking a lot about that. the intensification, because of course there's no huge amount of extra resources perhaps except in the north, so therefore increased production is going to have to come out of productivity gains, and a lot of that will come out of intensification of management systems and more precise management. As I said, a growing population of farm technical advisors. I'm not sure we've sort of worked out how to integrate those into, for example, the R&D system yet, because the reality is those farm technical advisors are the extension officers that work in agriculture now. We can forget about the public sector as the extension agency. Increasing integration of agricultural value chains, I've talked about that, the fact that the larger scale farmers increasingly supply direct to a processor or through a system which is completely different to what it was before, and the big focus, of course, the big challenge for all of us, increasing output value while improving productivity. That's, if you want to sum up in one sentence the mission statement for the future of agriculture in Australia, that really sums it up. So let's now get into the issue of leadership. Where is that going to take the sector? Well, I guess even though we're moving to a much more commercially oriented, government out, get out of the way and let us do business, bad things keep happening. So there's challenges from the community, there's challenges from a whole range of different aspects to the ability of farm businesses to get on and do that. So I don't think we can say, look, forget about it, we don't need the leadership structures we needed in the past, just get out of our way and let us do our business. Because I think those sort of challenges that are evident there and that actually result in constraints in the way that people can do their businesses are going to keep coming. So if the sector isn't developed a leadership system in a way that allows some response to that, some management of those issues, it is going to be to the disadvantage of the sector. So I don't think we can say, just forget it. So what we've seen is a breakdown of traditional structures and organisations, and I think that's two factors in that. One is the deregulation of the sector that occurred from the 90s through to 2000. While the industry was regulated with government involvement, there was a direct path to influence through the traditional farm organisations. In other words, by being a member of the farm organisation, you got to have a say on what the floor price for wool should be, or what the price for the dairy milk, the market dairy milk should be, and therefore that created an incentive to get involved. With deregulation, that ability to have a direct influence on those sort of things disappeared. I think the other thing is IT and communications, where you used to rely on your farm organisation for communications. Anyone now can go online and you can watch Parliament if you want to while you're sitting in the auto steer tractor. So, the ability to actually connect with and get information has certainly disappeared. I think the other thing that's happened is, as a result of that, we've seen the emergence of single focus groups. So I guess Lock the Gate is probably a classic example where in response to a challenge, a group came together and coalesced and can be quite effective. So the role of traditional structured organisations has probably been overcome in some of those situations by single focus groups. I've already mentioned the ability, even if none of you in the room are involved in farm organisations and the farm organisations are successful in getting a change to the backpacker tax, every one of you gets a free ride on that. So I'm going to think that's got worse with the IT and communications revolution that we've seen. We're also seeing increased specialisation in farm operations. So where the average mixed farm used to be a broadacre farm, we're now seeing much more specialised operations, and therefore the interests, instead of being broad, are much narrower in terms of what happens on those farms. So I think that has changed things as well. And that, of course, means there's fewer resources available for cross-sector and industry-wide issues. So how do we respond to these challenges? What's the message to you guys? Social media has certainly changed things, but I don't think anyone should think that that's a substitute for engagement with people. I think the biggest danger with social media is we can all talk to each other, but we can't talk to the audiences that probably matter, and it's self-reinforcing in many respects. So I think social media is certainly a great tool, but I don't think it's any substitute for personal engagement. I think the biggest challenge in Australia is of all the countries I've visited, Australia is the only country I've seen where farmers live in complete isolation on their farm businesses. And so you go to the Corn Belt in the US and they all live in town. And they all get in their pickups at 6:45 in the morning and off they go to the diner and they all sit down and talk together, and then they go off and do the work on all the various parts of their property, and then 5:30, 6 o'clock they're all back in at the coffee shop or the bar having a drink together. So there's quite a collegiate interaction between farmers there, and they're used to working together and talking about problems. Whereas I think Australia, we've got from our geography, a much more isolationist mentality in a lot of our farm operators, because they have to do things themselves. So, I think that biggest challenge is how do we get around that? I think engagement is at the local level is the starting point. So, production groups, a focus on production. I think getting involved in those is the foundation stone. When you look at the very successful farm groups internationally, like the American Farm Bureau, 95% of their effort is at the local level. Workshops, field days, all that sort of stuff. The political stuff is only worried about by about 5% of their members. So that getting engagement at the local level in a cropping group, in a production group of some sort, seems to me the foundation stone of getting a good system of leadership and representation in the farm sector. And then I think the other critical bit is getting off the farm, getting international travel, getting insights. I'm sure all of you have experienced this, that you go overseas with an idea about what the market looks like or what production looks like, and that gets trashed in about the first 24 hours, and you come back with I think if we had much bigger population of people in the farm sector who have some sense of the scale of the competition internationally and the challenges internationally, then we would spend much less time arguing whether this particular group or that particular group is the right one to represent the grain sector. I think trying to get that broader perspective is a real challenge, and it's not unrelated to the issue I talked about before. And I think the future leadership arrangements in the industry will perhaps more likely come out of coalitions of interest rather than grand structures. So if I take the cotton industry as an example, it's very active at the local level. Participants in the cotton organisations get very good production and that sort of service out of that organisation. And then the cotton industry is a participant in the NFF and understands that at the NFF level, big issues are dealt with, and cotton needs to work with other interests across the ag sector to get those sort of outcomes. So I think starting with grassroots types organisations, production organisations, and then creating coalitions of interest from those that allow the industry to come together on particular issues is probably what the model of the future looks like, although the reality is it's in the hands of the people in this room where that might particularly evolve. And I'll leave you with a very pertinent observation made many, many years ago, and I'll leave that as your challenge. Thank you.